One of the reasons I enjoy painting in Rebelle is that each mark on the canvas feels a lot more than just pixels. For example, when using the watercolor tool, it doesn't just sit there, it moves and reacts. And when painting with the acrylic tool and a dirty brush on, it reacts with what was below it. And it brings some of the fun of painting with traditional media, which is reacting to how the paint sits and behaves on the canvas. So in this video, I like to show how to think about making some brushes for the acrylic tool that can increase the feeling of working with paint, especially painting wet in wet. For example, if we were using oil paints. So I have three main brushes that I use. I have a brush that feels like it's got a lot of paint thinner, so maybe turpentine, for example. I have a drier brush which is sort of like using paint straight from the tube, so it's very lean and there's not too much paint medium or binder. And finally, I have a heavily loaded brush with lots of paint medium. So with oil painting, that would be like mixing a lot of linseed oil into the paint. So brush shapes can be made in any image editor like Photoshop, and right here in Rebelle works as well. Okay, in this part I'm making the brush shape for the thin brush with lots of paint thinner. The canvas I start with is 256 by 256 pixels, and using the white simple texture so that no canvas shows up in the brush shape. I'm setting the canvas color to black, since in Rebelle black is the non-paint or the transparent area of the brush shape. Turning down the visual settings for now, but that's not really necessary since we are using the white simple texture. Okay, so using the selection tool and setting it to circular selection, it's quite easy to draw out a circle by dragging out the control points to the edges. If snap to canvas in the view menu is on, that makes it much easier. And then using the airbrush tool, I just paint that selection in with white to represent the paint area of the brush. With the selection still active, just add a new layer and then set our color to 33 lightness, and then just airbrush in the dark gray onto that new layer. Now we can use the transform layer operation and just make a sort of crescent shape with the gray shape sitting on top of the white shape. Okay, so looking at this brush shape, what's going to happen is that the white crescent shape is going to produce a smooth gradient when used in the brush stroke, because in the middle here, the whites on either side of the circle are going to start doubling up on each other. I'm saving the brush shape into the default library folder that Rebelle uses. If you're not sure where this folder is, you can go to the help menu and there's a option to show library folder, and that will open it up and you can make note of the location. I'll just save the brush shape as a PNG file named tin. Okay, so loading that brush shape into the airbrush and with low spacing, we can see that smooth gradient I was talking about build up from the top to the bottom of the brush stroke. I'll just reset the airbrush back to default. And in the next part, I'll set up the brush settings for the thin brush in the brush creator. Okay, when making a brush, I usually use canvas size and texture that I usually paint with. And it's also good to use the usual brush size, zoom, and visual settings, stuff like that, to recreate the normal painting environment or the normal painting workflow that I would use. Okay, so let's load the thin.png saved earlier into the brush shape. And for the grain, a good streaky wet tin paint look. Grain 022 is a good grain to use. So here I'm adjusting pressure settings, and I like to use opacity at -100 because when using real life paint, it tends to go on thicker with a light touch. And when pressing down harder, it actually spreads the paint out more, and sometimes it might mix more with the wet paint underneath. And it can even start scraping up paint off the canvas if too much pressure is used. So here I'm just setting up the basic settings and the spacing and the opacity, and just testing to see how it's going. I'm setting the rotation to match the trajectory of the brush stroke. What's important for this brush is the scale setting for the grain. I usually just use a straight scaling value that I can adjust on the fly depending on the painting. The texture for the brush should be 0 to get that really thin and wet look. The -100 setting sort of mimics a brush stroke where you start out light, and as you make the stroke, you add pressure. So it's sort of typical for the type of brush stroke on canvas that I use. And there we can see it's coming together. Okay, so the main look is there. It's just about the opacity and grain scale now. Just testing and making strokes and adjusting and trying to get a feel of what the thin and wet brush stroke I'm used to when I paint in oils, and trying to get that same feeling for it. With the pressure size set to 90, there's quite a nice filbert-like shape that results from the brush stroke. Okay, that looks quite nice. I'll just use the little plus button at the bottom of the acrylic tool properties panel to create the new brush. And I might as well make a new group for the brush to keep it apart from the default brush set. So I'll just name the brush, and that's it for this one. For the dry and lean brush, we can just use one of the default shapes in the shapes folder, and it's called Shape Round Soft 4. And to get a very coarse looking grain for a very dry feel, a good grain to use would be Splats 03. For a really dry feeling, texture is important, so I'm setting it quite high here. Again, just making strokes and adjusting minute settings. What we want is to have a dry brush feel where if you lightly brush over the canvas, it leaves a lot of texture, and if you press down more, more paint gets laid down, so you see less of the texture. If you prefer a more typical pressure and opacity setting, like in many digital painting programs where pressing down harder results in thicker strokes, a pressure setting of 100 will also work for opacity. So once it looks good, just make a new preset with the plus button at the bottom of the panel again. And then we'll just name it. And don't forget to reset the thin brush, since we modified that one to make this brush. So let's test it and see how the brush strokes look side by side. That one feels wet and the other dry, so that's quite nice. In this part, we'll make the shape for the heavily loaded fat brush. Like the thin brush, I'm using a 256 by 256 pixel canvas with the white simple texture and the background color set to black. So just the same, making a circle selection with the selection tool and dragging it out to the edges of the canvas. And just airbrushing that in with white. And a new layer for the dark gray like before. Okay, so I'm not filling up the gray all the way up to the edges to get a softer edge to it, and just transforming the dark gray layer to make a ring shape. Saving that as fat, and in the next part will be the settings. Okay, so I'm setting up the brush on the usual canvas size and texture that I use. And using the lean brush as a starting point, I'll just load in the fat.png shape. And for the grain, I'm going to use sponge 1. We don't want too much texture because paint with a lot of oil tends to be smoother. And the same goes for the grain, so setting the scale up to 500, it blurs it and should make it look a lot smoother. What we want is a nice buttery feel to it. Or if you can believe it's chocolate, that's good too. And then just testing and adjusting and testing and adjusting. Okay, so that looks good. We'll just make a new preset with the plus button and give it a name. And don't forget to reset the lean brush back to its original settings. And that's the heavily loaded fat brush. So the reason the brush has a ring shape is to mimic the response of a filbert brush. That's because a filbert brush has a rounded tip, and when pressure is increased, the paint tends to get pushed out towards the sides when making the brush stroke, and the center tends to be thinner. So with the ring brush shape and the pressure opacity setting at -100, we get a similar type of stroke. Okay, so we have our 3 brushes, and let's just compare how they look side by side. The thin and wet brush, the dry and lean brush, and the heavy and oily brush. I'll upload these brushes to the Escape Motions forum if you'd like to download them directly. I'll also include my current brush set. The principles are the same, but the shapes I'm using for my brush set are a little bit less simple. You can check the description for the link. So I wanted to do a real-world test with these tutorial brushes, and I recorded a quick time-lapse painting using just these 3 brushes from the tutorial. The link to the video is in the description. So that's it for the video. I hope it gives some ideas of how to think about brush shapes and maybe what physical brushes might be doing. And even simple shapes can get quite convincing results. Thanks for watching.